everyone, and welcome to Colleen Connor's Seeing Eye Dog vlog, the Colleen and Joplin show. This episode is going to be about disabilities, and I am joined by a special guest, Cheryl. Hi! A lot of people have questions on what is a disability? Do I have a disability? Does my loved one have a disability? How do I get disability? So this is just the basics, and obviously this is not the end-all be-all. We are not the ADA or any kind of legal disability definition humans. But this is generally what we know, and we're gonna pass it on to you.
Yeah, so we did a little bit of research and we used our personal experience with people with disabilities to sort of just generally explain what that is.
I'm blind.
And I've worked with people with a variety of disabilities, including visual impairment and, yes, developmental disabilities, which we'll get into a little bit later. So, what is a disability?
What is a disability?
The short answer is impaired function or ability. That is the definition in Merriam-Webster Dictionary. There's also the definition, a little more long-winded, a physical, mental, cognitive, or developmental condition that impairs, interferes with, or limits a person's ability to engage in certain tasks or actions or participate in typical daily activities or interactions. Then there's the legal definition. So the Americans with Disabilities Act defines a disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. Those are slightly different, and medical disability might be different than legal disability, so it depends.
Yeah, it's very case-by-case basis, as is everything in life. So it's something like everyone's an individual.
What?
All of us are different, even if we have the same diagnoses. Speaking of diagnoses,
So there's a couple different groups of disabilities.
and we've grouped them. They're not like...
Yeah, this is our just grouping of how you might want to think about them, and there's different ways to think about them. For example, physical disabilities. Some people consider that just mobility or motor function disability, so like having to use a wheelchair sometimes, or having difficulty with fine motor skills. But sometimes, like I usually use physical disabilities to include hearing impairment and visual impairment or blindness.
Right, so it's, you kind of think of it as any kind of physical disability. So it interrupts with the function of a sense or a movement, or having like MS or visual impairment, or like you said, deafness, or it kind of encompasses a lot of things, and sometimes even speech would go under physical disability because there is something physically different.
Yes. There are also psychiatric disabilities, and those might include things like depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder. Any diagnosis that may impair your ability to do certain things or participate in daily life.
Correct, and some people don't consider these disabilities, and they are. There's actually people who, for instance, have major depression or anxiety, and that interferes with your function, with your life. And so they actually can get things like legally, for instance, disability payments from the government.
The last group, we've grouped together intellectual, developmental, and learning disabilities. So this includes things like Down syndrome, things like autism, even things like dyslexia, attention deficit disorder, things that impair your ability to learn or to interact with people based on brain function, I guess.
Yeah, and or behavior.
Yeah.
People who develop at a different rate than the majority of humanity.
Yeah.
So
those are some really general categories.
Yes.
And if you think that your disability doesn't belong in that particular category, feel free to let us know.
yeah, feel free to comment below. Also, people use their own terms that sometimes people don't like to have a learning disability. They want to call it a cognitive impairment, or some people don't want to say I'm blind. They would rather hear visual impairment. So again, it's very individualized, and some people might find these terms offensive, some people don't. So it's just kind of listen to what people's preferences are.
Yes.
Yeah.
So one question people might have is, why would you want to be diagnosed with a disability? Not necessarily why would you want a disability, because I don't think anyone wants a disability.
Some people feel that in their lives they would rather have one. There's a couple people who've maimed themselves just because they felt like they would want a disability. Majority though, you don't want it. You don't want it. This isn't fun. This is not.
You don't want to acquire a disability.
Correct. But if you do,
if you have a disability, you may want to be diagnosed with one, because that can be helpful for people to get accommodations or to have specific language to talk about their needs and how they perceive the world.
So if you are in school, for instance, sometimes it's not the best to tough out a situation if you would succeed better in classes by having accommodations, by having extra time on tests, or larger print. Do what's best for you in situations you may want a diagnosis, because it will help you get accommodations or legal backing for yourself to have language to explain what your differences might be.
It's also, you can think of it as a shortcut. So for example, Colleen sometimes calls herself blind, even though you're not technically completely blind.
Right. So I was sighted and I have cone rod dystrophy, so my vision is deteriorating over time. So my vision is very bad right now, but I still have some vision. And most visually impaired people do. I sometimes, if someone asks me, I'll say, yeah, I'm blind, because it's a lot easier than standing at a grocery counter and going, yes, I'm visually impaired, which actually means I'm partially sighted, sometimes referred to as partial or high partial. What that's going to mean is that I have some sort of disease, and it goes on and on. It's sometimes easier to just say, I'm blind, and let them think I can't see anything, because that's the majority of humanity thinks that when you say you're visually impaired or blind, you can see nothing.
So why would someone want to disclose their disability or want to not disclose their disability?
It depends on the situation. However, again, I think if you wanted accommodations in school or a job or some sort of social situation, you may want to disclose your disability. If you have a physical disability, it's often not very easy to not disclose your disability, because, for instance, I will walk in with a seeing eye dog, or someone will walk in with a cane or in a wheelchair, and it's a little hard at that point to be like, I'm not disclosing what my disability is. You don't want to shock people. I believe that if you are in a job interview or if you want to go to a job, you may not want to disclose your disability on your resume, but before you get there to an interview, you might want to let them know you're arriving via paratransit and you will be walking in with a service dog because you're visually impaired.
And although it is illegal to not hire someone based on their disability, there does come with it a bit of discrimination. So although someone may not technically refuse to hire you because you're disabled, they may question whether or not you can do the job. For example, a lot of job postings may have things like you must be able to lift and bend, stuff like that, things that technically people who use wheelchairs may not be able to do. That is okay to require of someone, but if the best person for the job has a disability that prevents them from doing certain things, it may be better to be able to accommodate them.
And unfortunately there is a lot of discrimination, but I'm not going to apply to be an Uber driver because I can't drive. That's an accommodation that's unreasonable.
Yes.
Versus if I can completely do the job as a receptionist and my only issue is that I can't recognize people who come through the door. For instance, I don't want to call it mild, but like if you have dyslexia or something like that, some people choose not to disclose the disability because it doesn't interfere with their life as much.
If you don't think that it's important that your employer know about the disability and you do your job just fine without having any accommodations or having whatever you can provide as accommodations, then you don't need to. Another thing to keep in mind is that different disabilities require different accommodations, and they don't all go together in one disability bucket.
Yeah, you don't have to group us in. So when I first arrived at college, I was there for early orientation so I could be oriented to the campus. And so I was there early, but there was another person there who was also there for early orientation who was profoundly deaf. Great guy. They showed us to the cafeteria. They basically said, well, why don't you guys get to know each other, because you're both going to be working with the disability office, and have lunch, and then there's a couple of hours, and then we'll come get you at your dorms, so just make your way back to your dorms. He was profoundly deaf. He didn't lip read very well, and he wasn't very verbal, so he didn't like to speak. He'd not had a lot of speech therapy, and so he was hard to understand. And I'm visually impaired. So we were like, well, we're a pair, because we had nothing against each other, but we could not communicate. So, he's trying to help me figure out what's in the buffet, what's at, this specific restaurant, but he can't really talk to me or hear me, and I can't see him. So, it was a whole thing that just was ridiculous. And we ended up going back to our dorms and just being like, sorry, because we can't communicate. Sometimes people just feel like we all can go together. We all just, oh, you're all disabled, and they just throw us in the same room, and it's like, not all of us can communicate well. Now, we don't automatically know how to treat every other disabled person.
Another question would be, what should you do if your child or family member is diagnosed with a disability? And I would say, if you're the caregiver for that person, probably do some research about the condition and find some suggestions. And if it's just a family member or something, maybe talk to the person who has the disability, or their parent or guardian if the child can't communicate their needs very well. Treat them like you have been treating them. Just because they suddenly have a diagnosis doesn't mean that they're different.
Also, I feel a lot of parents make the mistake of then coddling their child or sheltering them from the world. And I think that is a disservice to someone, especially if you are visually impaired and you end up going to a blind school, a school for the blind. If you've only ever been around other blind people, your social skills and things like that can be affected. A lot of people, I feel, underestimate people with disabilities and how independent they can be, and don't listen to them. They might not teach their child how to do their laundry or how to cook, and they could very feasibly do that. So life skills are important, and also if you need to advocate for someone, the important thing is to remain confident and calm and just tell people what your child or loved one might need, especially if they've been diagnosed with a disability later in life. You can be supportive and loving, but at the same time make sure that they have the tools to be as independent as possible. And I would say the best thing for that nowadays is do some online research, and you can contact different societies, government agencies, different doctors, or people that can assist you in knowing where to go or how to get help financially, things like that.
How can we help someone with a disability if we don't have that disability?
The best way to help someone with a disability is to ask them how you might help them with what they need to do. Also, don't assume we need help because we have an impairment of some kind. Listen to and respect what someone says.
Yes.
If they appear that they're struggling and you say, "Can I help you?" and they say, "No, I've got it," don't help them anyway. Also, if they say, "Yes, that would be great," ask, "Okay, how can I help?" instead of assuming you know what they want help with.
So why are disabled people so sensitive about terminology? And I actually found a very good quote from a website called Disability World that says, "Within the disability sector, generally language matters. For a group of people who have been so relentlessly described in disparaging, reductionist, and exclusive terms, language matters profoundly." So if you think about some of the common terms that have been used in the past to describe people with disabilities, a lot of them are mean. So the term idiocy, a lot of people nowadays use it to insult someone's intelligence, right?
You're an idiot.
Initially, it was actually a medical term.
Correct.
That was used. If you look at old census data, that was considered a medical condition.
P.S. If you want to laugh, please go look at old census data.
So, If you think about some of the terms that people don't want used, a lot of them are mean and outdated. Generally, right now, you don't want to use terms like restricted to, victim of, suffers from. Instead, you want to use something like a person with a disability or a person who has blindness.
Correct. I'm a person first. A disability is just something that I have.
That is language that is called person first language. And typically, really just think about the person and what they are besides their disability. The R word and the C word,
which we will define. These are terrible. It's if you say retarded or cripple.
Yes. Do not use those terms.
Not terms we use.
Unless you are talking about retarding a note in music.
Yes.
That is the only time you should use that term.
Meaning slowing down.
Yes.
Also, handicapped is no longer a term that we use. It is now disability.
Unless you're talking about things like handicapped parking spaces. That is still used.
Correct.
So sometimes it's okay, but generally if you're talking about a person with a disability works perfectly.
And some people, again, are moving towards different terms depending on the school. So there are things such as exceptionalities. Sometimes for little kids, they'll do things differently. So again, it's just about asking the person what they might prefer.
Yes, and be wary of using things like that, like exceptionality, to describe an adult, unless they have asked you to say that.
Correct.
Because that can also be condescending.
Correct.
You wouldn't want someone to come up with you and say, well, similarly, you're so special. Usually, that's not a nice thing if you have a disability.
Right.
Can people with disabilities work and hold jobs?
Very well.
Depending on your disability, certain jobs may be easier for you or more difficult for you, or less fitted for you, just like any other person.
And because we have to overcome certain adversities, no offense to anyone, and this is a generalization, but we also tend to be more dedicated, serious, and productive about our jobs because we are used to having to focus and having to struggle to do things, and we're most of the time we're very appreciative to have a job, so we treat it good, you know.
Yeah, and typically people with disabilities may need certain accommodations, but they should be able to tell you what they need, and you should never assume what they need.
Correct. And people with disabilities just self-advocate. You can do a job, and you can do a job well, and it doesn't have to be moving books slightly to the left.
Why would people with disabilities need financial assistance?
Because it's hard to find a job. It's hard to get hired. Medical equipment and accommodations can be expensive if you don't have assistance from the government or an agency.
People with disabilities also tend not to make as much money.
Correct.
Whether it's because of their disability or because of their situation in life. Also keep in mind that if someone with a disability has a job that pays well, they do not get financial assistance from the government in the US, or they may not.
Correct. And especially in other countries as well.
So don't assume that someone, because they have a disability, they get free money.
There's no free money.
What does the US government do to help people with disabilities?
The United States government right now has something called Social Security, which is not as secure as it used to be.
And this is Social Security disability, not
Correct.
Social Security you get when you retire.
Correct. So there are two categories to Social Security, and you can find out a lot about it at socialsecurity.gov. But Social Security disability is set up, and it takes a lot of paperwork and time. However, you can prove that you have a disability, and then depending on your financial situation and the severity of your disability, you will get a certain monthly stipend. And that's provided by the government, and it is tax-free.
And we can get into the legal ramifications of disability and some more about Social Security payments in a different video.
Correct. So in summary, this video was about what is a disability, why we would want to get diagnosed with a disability, what to do around people with disabilities, and what people with disabilities are capable of. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. Like this video, favorite it, share it with everyone, because advocacy and awareness of this is very, very, very important and underdone.
If you have a different definition of what a disability is, or have terms you prefer other than the commonly used terms, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe.
Click the little bell so that you can be notified of when I upload new videos.
And if you liked this video, click the thumbs up.
Thank you for joining me, Cheryl.
You're welcome.
Yay! And what people with disabilities are capable of, and when need help. When needed help.
When? Like right now.
Yes! Mouth words.
Other than what is typically understood.
You're gonna have to redo that one.
I cannot! Can I have the electric thing?
You might have scared it away with your
I just would have to